Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. We are joined with Dr. Peter Adamson to discuss the medieval use of authority in Latin and Islamic scholasticism. One of the interesting debates that occurred during the Middle Ages was an ongoing debate regarding the epistemic role that authority had in relation to rational analysis, specifically in matters of religious assent. We are joined today with Dr. Adamson to discuss those debates. Dr. Adamson, thank you so much for joining with us today.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So I figured if my listeners are unaware of your work or haven't heard of your work, maybe you could just give a brief introduction of who you are and what your area of specialization is.
Okay, sure. I'm a professor of philosophy at the LMU in Munich. I used to be at King's College London before that, and before that I got my PhD at Notre Dame, and there was a before that as well. I was a child once, for example, but now I guess if listeners are familiar with me, it might be through my podcast, which is called the History of Philosophy podcast, or the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, which has been running since 2010. And I also do a lot of work in my kind of day job on late ancient philosophy, especially Neoplatonism and philosophy in the Islamic world. I occasionally range into Latin scholasticism as well. And maybe the most relevant thing I've done for this conversation we're going to be having is a book that came out last year with University of Notre Dame Press called Don't Think for Yourself. And it's about exactly this issue of authority and belief formation in medieval philosophy. And in that, I try to look at this theme in the Islamic world, in Latin scholasticism, and also to some extent, even in Byzantine medieval philosophy.
It's one of the interesting debates that I think is, even though it was done centuries ago, it's still very much relevant for the time period in which we are in right now, where questions of assenting to authority can be contentious. They're very easily called into question and can be very polarized, but it's still a very much an important debate nowadays. Not just with respect to religious assent, but even in matters of like public policy and medical advice.
Yeah, that's why I wrote the book. Actually, I sometimes think that scholars of the future will look back at the period of scholarly literature now and say, oh yeah, you can tell that those books were written around 2020. Actually, I think my book feels like it's a response to COVID, but it's actually not. It was written before COVID happened. So I was editing it, but the actual book was written before the coronavirus came along, but it just became even more of a salient issue, like, should we believe all these scientists telling us to get vaccinated and so on? So I didn't write the book with that in mind, but I wrote it with, things like Brexit in mind, where economists were all screaming, no, please don't do this. And the British people were like, well, we're going to ignore your advice. Or obviously like the Donald Trump presidency, which threw up all of these issues about who can you believe, who can you trust. So yeah, unfortunately, maybe it's a very current topic, despite being a topic that I'm addressing from the point of view of medieval philosophy.
You discuss in your book about these two sort of juridical notions in medieval Islam, taqlid, and then there's this other notion of ijtihad. What is taqlid and ijtihad? How exactly did the Islamic jurists conceive of these two notions?
Taqlid is a really useful word, actually, and something that I would like to see come out of my book is that more people know what it means, because it's just such a useful concept to have a single word for it. And you can tell that we don't really have a single word for it in the way that it's translated into English. Usually people translate taqlid as something like uncritical acceptance of authority, which is exactly what it means, at least in this context. So someone is a muqallid. So a muqallid is someone who is engaging in taqlid. So you're a muqallid if you are following someone else's advice about what to believe without having, to put it kind of vaguely, without having figured it out for yourself, or without having put yourself in a good enough position to evaluate whether the belief in question is true. So to put it in a more straightforward way, it's just believing things because other people say that they're true. That's taqlid. Ijtihad comes from a verb which means to make effort. And actually, the famous Arabic word jihad is related. It's from the same verbal root. So jihad actually means struggle. People always think it means holy war, but that's just a kind of struggle, right? So jihad means struggle. And if you have engaged in ijtihad, it means that you have made an effort, or you've struggled with the issue at hand, and you've put yourself in a position to have kind of an informed view on it. So that's why these two terms are antonyms. So taqlid is the opposite of ijtihad, because it means that you haven't made an effort to figure it out for yourself, and ijtihad means that you have.
Right. And one of the early debates
in the Islamic theological and juridical context was trying to figure out the relationship between these two notions, between the sort of reasoned, informed judgment, or the acceptance of an authority. How would you best describe the emergence of what you might say of this debate in the Islamic theological tradition? Did it have a particular beginning or trend? What was ijtihad always employed in, theological disputes or debates? It probably, obviously, it has to be if it's a debate or a dispute.
Well, the case that I make in my book, which I think would require more historical investigation to really confirm, but it seems to make sense chronologically, is that it's really a contrast that emerges at first in as you said, in a juridical context. And then, because a lot of the theologians are jurists, the theologians start using the terminology in a similar way. And then eventually it finds its way into philosophical discussions. So the thought would be that what you first get is the idea that a jurist, like a judge, right, is making decisions just following precedent, without thinking about the rationale behind the ruling. And actually, it's even been suggested that a less pejorative way of translating taqlid would be precedent in this context. So all I'm doing is like, okay, there is this, authoritative judge who had a very similar case. I just look at what they did and I apply the same ruling. And you could see that, as always with precedent in philosophy of law, there's a strong argument for a precedent and also a worry you might have. So the argument for it is that you want people to be able to expect the law to reach the same results in similar cases, right? So if a judge is presented with exactly the same situation that another judge was presented with before, it's good if people know that the same result will follow, or the same judgment will be made. The worry you might have is that if the second judge doesn't understand why the first authoritative judge passed their verdict, then they may miss something that's important, right? So, or they may miss that there's some kind of extenuating circumstance, which means that the judgment wouldn't be appropriate in this case, right? So to give a simple case, suppose that someone comes before a judge who's been accused of theft. The judge is convinced that the person's really a thief, and they just look at a previous case to see how many years of prison to give. So they just give 5 years of prison because, a similar judgment was passed by another judge. But they don't take into account, for example, that this thief was, had a hard childhood, or was put up to it by some other person, or maybe didn't know what was going on, didn't realize they were stealing, right? So the idea is that a really qualified jurist is not someone who's mechanically applying judgments, but someone who actually understands how the law is grounded in the sources of the law, which in this case would mean the Quran and the Hadith, so the revelation in the Quran, and then the Hadith, that means the reports about things the Prophet said and did. So these are the primary sources of law for Islamic jurisprudence. And then to some extent, you're allowed to use your own reasoning to kind of fill in the gaps. So if it doesn't say in the Quran or the Hadith clearly what the judgment would be, you're allowed to kind of extrapolate from what it does say.
One of the examples that you give in your book is how there was this question about whether different types of alcohol could be admitted as being as being ethical and in consumption, whether the Quran may condemn the drinking of wine, but it never said anything regarding the drinking of whiskey or something. And there was this one Islamic jurist who made a sort of proportional analogy argument saying, hey, if we condemn drinking wine because it's alcoholic and whiskey is itself alcoholic, then we shouldn't be drinking whiskey. Or that'd be an example of that.
Yeah, that's the traditional example that people always give. Maybe a more fun version of the same example is that later on in the Ottoman Empire, they start drinking coffee. And then people say, well, hang on a second, is coffee kind of like wine because it's intoxicating? So is coffee legal or not?
Interesting.
And here we need to understand what they call the basis of the legal judgment. So again, some kind of rational reflection is required here. So why did God forbid the drinking of wine? So one thought would be, well, you shouldn't be trying to figure out why. You're not God. Just do whatever it says, right? And if it doesn't forbid the drinking of coffee in the Quran, then coffee's fine. So that would be one attitude you might have. But a more common attitude in the mainstream legal schools was that you should try to understand the rationale behind the forbidding of wine, and then you could apply it to new cases, and they had to decide whether coffee was a sufficiently analogous case or not.
I see. That makes
So
sense.
from there, what happens is that this whole concept of taqlid versus ijtihad. So ijtihad in this context would mean something like trying to understand the basis of the legal ruling, right? Usually within the tradition of your own legal school. So if you're like a Shafi'i jurist, a follower of the jurist Shafi'i, then you would be trying to understand at least the grounds for the judgments laid down by Shafi'i and be able to extrapolate from them to further cases, right? But then theologians start to apply the concept to things like belief in the existence of God, right? So why do I believe in God? Well, is it just because my mother and father told me that God exists? That would be taqlid. Ijtihad would be that either I can prove the existence of God myself, like I've come up with a proof, or I've understood a proof that someone else has given me, and I'm not just kind of going through it by rote. It's like, well, they say it's a good proof, so it's a good proof. No, rather I'm looking at the proof and understanding, and I was like, oh, I understand why that's a good proof. Or at the very, if not that, then I at least am believing in God because I have good reason to follow the authoritative judgments of other people, right? So, for example, and this kind of gets into more subtle discussions that I get into later on in the book, you might think that it's good enough to avoid taqlid if you don't really understand what's going on, but you at least understand who the expert is, right? So for example, if I have an illness and I go to the doctor, you might think if I just do whatever the doctor tells me to do that I'm engaging in taqlid, but you might think, well, it's kind of taqlid to do whatever the doctor says, but it's kind of not, because at least I've like got a good reason for thinking that this is a trustworthy doctor. Right. So I'm not just blindly following the authority of others. So really, I mean, if you go back to the translation of taqlid as uncritical acceptance of authority, the question is really what is involved in being critical? Does it mean I have to become an expert myself and figure everything out from scratch? Does it mean I have to become enough of an expert to understand the expert judgments and why they were reached, which is what they usually thought? Or could it be less demanding than that? Namely, I only need to identify who the right experts are.
Right. Then how, if I may ask, did this shift from a juridical setting to a more
theological and eventual philosophical setting in the Islamic tradition? Can you tell us anything about that trajectory?
I think that the passage from juridical to theological context is almost imperceptible because they're usually the same people.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
So they effectively just kind of broaden the notion of taqlid to include things that don't look at first glance to be legal, but actually in a way that's kind of one body of knowledge from their point of view, right? So think about, for example, the fact that the entirety of the law is based on the Quran, as I said, and then the things that the prophet said and did, but you have to know he's the prophet, right? And so something you often see the theologians saying is, well, before we get into law or theology, we need to know that Islam is true. And something that's very striking about Islamic theology is that it was a very standard view that the first step in theology is verifying the truth of the prophet and the prophecy. So you have some kind of argument for why the Quran must be a genuine revelation. And then once you've got that in hand, you can say, okay, now I can believe that the rest of what it says without engaging in taqlid, right?
Right.
So the more complicated part of the story is how does that come into philosophy? And by philosophy here, I really mean the kind of philosophy that's associated with the reception of Aristotelian and other Greek philosophy in the Islamic world, which is a long story, but there is this tradition, which I actually called falsafa, which is based on the Greek word philosophia. And these are people who are doing philosophy in a way that's often very original, but is still somehow inspired by and engaging with Aristotelian and Platonist philosophy.
Right.
So what I argue in the book is that these philosophers say, well, if the goal is to avoid taqlid and to engage in ijtihad, then we're the ones who are really doing that, because philosophy is the study of truth on the basis of actual demonstrations. We have real demonstrations. You guys just argue with each other, but we demonstrate things. So the ultimate kind of ijtihad would be to engage in Aristotelian philosophy and then to prove for sure what the truth is. And then we can kind of use that as a check on possible interpretations of the Islamic revelation. So this is something you particularly get strongly in Ibn Rushd, who's often called Averroes. So he's famous as a commentator on Aristotle, but it's not a coincidence that he was also a jurist. And in fact, his father and grandfather were jurists as well. So he comes up from a family of lawyers and judges. And he is seeing that whole kind of set of ideas about avoiding taqlid, engaging in ijtihad, could be transposed to an argument for engaging in Aristotelian philosophy.
It's very interesting you say how Aristotle became very, very popular in the Islamic world, sort of prior to the reemergence in sort of the context of Latin scholasticism. Were the falsafa or the philosophers in the context of Islam, were they ever accused of sort of engaging in sort of cult following practice of Aristotle, or in the sense that, if I remember correctly, one of the charges that al-Ghazali sort of famously makes to the falsafa is they don't necessarily have a problem with authority, but they just have a problem with authority of the Quran. They have an authority, and their authority is Aristotle.
Absolutely, yeah. He's the best example. So al-Ghazali is a bit before Ibn Rushd. So Ghazali dies in 1111 of the Common Era, which is easy to remember, so that's good. And Ibn Rushd dies in 1198. And Ibn Rushd is often responding to Ghazali's critique of philosophy. And in that critique, Ghazali says that the philosophers, the falasifa, are engaging in taqlid by just following whatever Aristotle teaches, right? So this supposed appeal that Ibn Rushd will make later to the grand demonstrations that you have in philosophy, from al-Ghazali's point of view, is just a matter of, without thought, uncritically parroting what Aristotle said. And of course, Ibn Rushd is completely outraged by this and says, no, that's not true. What we're doing is we're grasping the demonstrative nature of his proofs and then representing them so that they're, easier to follow, maybe, and also maybe expounding or expanding on them. So applying Aristotelian insights to new problems, that sort of thing.
Right. I mean, a more charitable sort of reading of these philosophers during this period is that while they are adopting Aristotelian theses, it's not as though that they're just uncritically like parroting the exact text of Aristotle for other people to hear. I mean, if you think of, I had a while ago, Dr. John McInnes came on to discuss Avicenna, and he has a lot of theses that you might say are inspired by Aristotle, but very obviously depart in many ways from Aristotelian philosophy.
Yeah, I've always thought it was a little bit ironic that Ghazali attacks Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as he's often called in English. He really has Ibn Sina in mind when he makes this accusation about taqlid, which is bizarre in a way, because Ibn Sina is extravagantly and explicitly original, and he's probably the most original medieval philosopher of any culture, actually. So to accuse him of taqlid is sort of like accusing Karl Marx of being too solicitous of the needs of the capitalists.
Right.
It's like a completely wrong-headed accusation. But of course, in a way, what Ghazali is trying to do there is to say, well, this rhetoric of independent mindedness and so on that we're getting from Ibn Sina is really just rhetoric. And if you look at what he's doing, actually he just follows all of these points because they're found in Aristotle. So he's, at least I think you can credit Ghazali with attacking Ibn Sina in a place where it would hurt. Because Ibn Sina would find this to be a very outrageous and offensive accusation. And I think it's sort of stepping away from all that and, you know, how justified the accusation is. I think the really noteworthy thing, and the thing that people often miss, is that everybody agrees that taqlid is bad. Right? So we have this idea that medieval cultures are very authority bound, and that thinking for yourself and coming up with innovative new ideas is sort of frowned upon and so on. And we get this idea from the Latin medieval context, which we'll go on to, I guess, where the idea of being innovative was often used as a critique, right? So sort of stop trying to be so original. What's wrong with you, you know? Whereas in the Islamic world, the accusation they love to throw at each other is they're not being, if not original, they're not thinking for themselves. Like they're not figuring it out on their own. They're just following some authority. So I think, at least, I'm not sure if it's ultimately a big difference in what philosophers and theologians actually did, but the rhetoric of accusation and counter-accusation is very different in the Islamic world.
And if I also may ask, did any sort of, you might say, elitism grow as a result of these debates of ijtihad and taqlid? Like, was it more acceptable for certain people to engage in ijtihad than for others to just fall back in line? Like, were there any debates in that department?
Definitely. In fact, all the people we're talking about were flagrant elitists. And I mean, we need to bear in mind also, this is not a society in which, you know, half the
egalitarian
university or something, right? I mean, probably less than 1% of the population can read, I'm guessing. And so when these people say, oh, you shouldn't engage in taqlid, you should, you know, work at it, try to figure out the basis of what you believe, what they mean is you should do that if you want to be one of the scholars, so-called ulama. Actually, Ghazali, who clearly thinks that taqlid is a very bad thing, so he's always, you know, like I say, he's throwing this accusation at Ibn Sina and so on. He explicitly says elsewhere that for common people, taqlid is appropriate. That's what they should do, because they don't have the mental equipment and training to engage in ijtihad. So a kind of moderate view, which you get in some theologians, is that people, like normal people, should engage in ijtihad, but only to a very limited degree. So, for example, they should at least understand why it makes sense to accept Muhammad's prophecy, and they should maybe be able to give a simple proof of God's existence, which would be a bad thing if they can do that. There are even stories about theologians kind of quizzing hoi polloi on, like, how do you know that God exists, right? But if it gets into anything more advanced than that, like judgments of the law, they didn't want people kind of going off the rails and making stuff up on their own, because of course they're the authoritative knowledge bearers, these theologians and jurists, and so they have no interest in hoi polloi challenging their authority or saying, well, let us think about that. They want their authority to be accepted. So it's taqlid for most people, but ijtihad for the scholars.
Interesting. Okay. And then another interesting debate that occurred at this time was what exactly constitutes certainty, whether or not you could be certain in a person's testimony, in addition to like demonstration or something. And then how broadly did Islamic theologians conceive of certainty? I mean, the philosophers probably at this time are going to make the claim that, you know, you can only assent to something on the basis of demonstration. Well, maybe not all of them. If I remember correctly, Avicenna has a more modest view on this, where he does seem to make the case that testimony can grant you certainty.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting feature in Sina's epistemology. So the initial situation is that you have a very strong contrast between what the Aristotelians would say and what the theologians would say. So the Aristotelians, looking at Aristotle's own work on epistemology, which is the Posterior Analytics, not a very appealing title, but that's what it was called. They think that certainty is when you have a proof of something. I mean, there are first principles that you can be certain about, which are the ultimate roots of demonstration. But other than that, everything has to be demonstrated through rock solid arguments. So that's knowledge, that's certainty. Whereas in Islamic legal and theological tradition, there's a lot of dependence on the idea of transmitted knowledge. And this has to do especially with what I mentioned earlier, the hadith. So if you're basing your legal judgments on things that Muhammad said and did, as opposed to the Quran, then how do you know that he really said and did these things? And the answer is that there springs up this whole science of hadith criticism, where they sort out reports about things. So there are all these reports circulating about what Muhammad said and did, and they try to nail down the ones that are reliable through chains of transmission back to the person who was actually there when it happened. And the idea is that every link in the chain should be a trustworthy, pious witness. So so-and-so was there when Muhammad said this, and then so-and-so told so-and-so about it, and so-and-so told so-and-so, and so-and-so told so-and-so who told me, right? And these people are all trustworthy. Even better is if you have multiple chains back to the original event, like 4 people saw it happen, and they all reported it, and they reported it to trustworthy people, so we have 4 independent chains. Or you can have like intersecting chains, right? So they use this criterion to tell the difference between sound and unsound hadith. So in that context, actually, knowledge by testimony is the paradigm of good knowledge, right? And what happens in Ibn Sina is that he considers the concept of certainty and says, well, there are different kinds of certainty that you might have. So for example, you might have certainty about something because you saw it happen yourself, right? And that also isn't certainty through a proof. That's just direct witnessing. So that's a kind of certainty. There's a kind of certainty that comes from direct proof. There's a kind of certainty that comes from extrapolating from many things you've seen to a kind of empirical generalization. And there's certainty that comes from testimony. And it's actually very interesting that he's willing to accept testimony as a source of certainty. Whether he thinks ultimately that that's as good as the certainty you would get from a demonstrative syllogism in the Aristotelian style is doubtful. But the point is that he at least counts it as part of what you can know.
Well, that's an interesting point, that you almost get the idea that in the context of these debates, it's conceded that there are gradations of certainty, and that you ought to assent to things when the you might say that you ought to be proportionally certain to the type of thing, to the type of evidence that is given. So like your certainty regarding first principles, like non-contradiction, it's going to be slightly different than the certainty of the conclusion of a syllogism. Even if that syllogism's rock solid, it just the evidence that is given is going to afford different gradations of certainty.
Yeah, and actually, it's al-Farabi who's the first person in the Arabic tradition to make that point. So he wrote a treatise called The Conditions of Certainty, where he gives a whole set of different criteria that need to be satisfied for full certainty. And he says that if you only have some of the criteria satisfied, then you have some level of certainty, but not full or perfect certainty. And by the way, just to make sure people see the connection to what we've been talking about with taqlid, so So you might think, and in fact, I think Aristotelians traditionally had thought, well, if I just believe something because someone told me that it happened, that would be the equivalent of taqlid, right? So I wasn't there when it happened, but so-and-so said that it happened. So I'm just going on what they said.
Mm.
Right? And with hadith criticism, where you're trying to verify whether these reports are dependable, you start to get this idea, which becomes very sophisticated, that there could be a whole set of methods for evaluating testimony and figuring out whether the testimony is reliable. And of course, that wouldn't only apply to things that the prophet said and did. It could apply to any kind of testimony. And it could maybe even apply to things like expert advice, like the doctor, right? So I think in general, it's symptomatic of a wider trend towards thinking that your duty as an epistemic agent, in some cases, might be to figure it out for yourself.
Mm.
In other cases, it might be to just follow someone else's advice, but that won't be taqlid in the pejorative sense, as long as you've done sort of due diligence on figuring out that that person is worth believing. So the idea would be that believing something on the grounds of authority is okay, as long as you verify that the authority is really authoritative.
Right.
And that's something that I think came into philosophy through these legal and theological conversations.
Well, as I understand it, that and you make the case in your book that that's more or less what the case that Al-Ghazali sort of gives, that you can assent to an authority figure, but in doing so, you have to sort of separate the good authority figures from the bad authority figures. You have to engage in, which would constitute a reliable authority figure. You have to engage in this process yourself. So you're not necessarily building everything from the ground up, like a rationalist, philosophical proof, but you're not merely just accepting something on the basis of pure testimony on a whim.
Right. And in fact, it's very telling that he makes that point in the context of talking about verifying for yourself that the Prophet Muhammad was a genuine prophet. And he says, well, how would you do that? You'd go about it in the same way that you would go about choosing a doctor. So it's, again, the parallel between the religious case and the scientific case. So the way I figure out whether someone's a doctor is I kind of size the person up and think, well, is this person behaving like a doctor? Like, do they have credentials? He doesn't actually say very much about what you would have to do to verify that someone is a doctor, but he kind of suggests, well, there are ways of doing this, right? We all know who the doctors are. I mean, in the modern context, it's the equivalent of like, oh, do they have a diploma on their wall? Is the diploma from a good university?
Right.
Do other people say it's a good doctor? So there are, in fact, things we do to verify for ourselves that doctors are reliable, even though we're not doctors. And of course, we have no idea really, like whether the medical judgment is itself correct, but we can do this other thing where we put ourselves in a position where we have good reason to think that this person has the right kind of expertise, right? And Ghazali says that's what you should do with the prophet. So you should look at the things he said and did. Again, you're consulting the hadith here. And you should think, that is exactly the sort of thing I would expect a genuine prophet to say and do, right? Like he was incredibly just and he never lied, and et cetera, right? So it's the same kind of method. And I think the kind of interesting upshot, to go back to the point about applying this to contemporary world, is that you might think part of the problem we've been having politically is a failure to agree on what makes someone an authority in this way, right? So, for example, it used to be that academic credentials from well-respected universities made people authoritative. And now for a certain segment of the population, it actually makes them suspect.
Mm.
You've got a PhD from Harvard. That means you're exactly the kind of person I won't trust, right?
Right.
So that's one thing that's been happening. And another thing that's been happening is that people have, maybe because of the internet, just been losing sight of the whole project, right? So if they can find anything that sort of supports their way of viewing the situation, for them, that's confirmation. And they're not thinking enough about, well, what is the source? Is this person trustworthy? They're kind of verifying trustworthiness on the basis of whether it agrees with them, rather than on the basis of judging the person as an authoritative figure, authoritative in the sense of reliable.
Right. So there's one more question I figured I could ask before we maybe shift to sort of Latin scholastic, you might say, antecedents during around this time. There's one concern that is either implicitly or maybe even explicitly made in the context of these Islamic debates, is that one of the problems with, you might say, of taqlid is that there's really nothing meritorious about just uncritically assenting to an authority figure. You just happen to be lucky. If it happens to be the case that you assent to the right one, you're just lucky. You struck it rich. But there's nothing meritorious about it. Or maybe meritorious isn't the right word. But did you see what I'm saying? I think you talk about it in the book as sort of like epistemic luck, you might say, is a concern.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say it's not meritorious. I mean, I think that's a good point, although it's not really one I get into in the book. So you might think, well done, you believed in God, which is true obviously from a Muslim point of view, but you don't really get any credit for it because you only believe in God because your parents told you to, right? But I think there might be something to that, but there's another issue which I think is more salient in the texts, which is that if you're just lucky because you followed the right authority, then things could have just as easily gone badly for you. So there's this idea that you find in Ghazali that if a Muslim child had been born to a Christian or Jewish family, then their beliefs would be different. And from his point of view, their beliefs would be false, even though the child is engaging in exactly the same method as the Muslim child who has Muslim parents, i.e. taqlid. So if you just go with taqlid, then you're just basically hoping that you were born into a family which follows the right religion, right? And he's like, well, that's not good enough. Like, I can't possibly base something as important as my religious belief on the happenstance of which family I happen to be born into. And so that is what he says pushed him into not being satisfied with taqlid anymore and trying to engage in ijtihad to verify for himself that Islam is actually the correct faith by figuring out that Muhammad was really a prophet.
Right. Yeah. Oh, and but by the way, I mean, for the listeners back at home, I mean, if you ever want to learn about al-Ghazali, I mean, his autobiography, I think it's "Deliverance from Error" is the title. It's a really fascinating. Like I've heard people compare it sometimes to like Augustine's Confessions. Like it's pretty much just his sort of cycle from sort of cocky like philosopher to sort of having a crisis of faith and a sort of an existential crisis, and then sort of finally through not just mysticism but through other Islamic practices, he finds the way out of that slough, you might say.
And the good thing is it's a lot shorter than Augustine's Confessions.
Yes, that's very true.
Read it in an hour rather than in a day or two, which is what you need for the Confessions.
Right, exactly. It's also a lot easier to. Well, I don't know about the Arabic, but I just remember reading Augustine's Latin for Latin class, and it's very poetic, it's very beautiful, but it's also really difficult. So, anyway,
because he's trying to write like Cicero.
Right, exactly. Right. But anyway, I figured then we can maybe we could maybe shift the conversation to discussing Latin scholasticism and their conception of authority. And correct me if I'm wrong, but at least for my engagement in medieval philosophy more generally, there wasn't as much of a concern about assenting to authority, because I mean it was sort of assumed that the articles of faith can't be demonstrated, and there were even debates about this, that you can't demonstrate things like the Trinity or the Incarnation. You just have to accept it on the basis of divine revelation. But there was another debate going on in Latin scholasticism regarding which authority or authoritative text is credible, or which authority we ought to give more credence rather than another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I agree with both those things. Maybe the first thing to say here is that Christianity differs from Islam in having several key teachings that look like they would be very difficult or probably impossible to prove rationally. So God is a Trinity, God was incarnated as a human, and also things like transubstantiation or whatever is going on in the Eucharist. So these are obviously miraculous things which are explicitly said to transcend our understanding. And for that, that's why there's no Christian version of Ibn Rushd's position that the philosopher will figure everything out and then use that as a kind of check on interpretations of scripture. There are philosophers like Peter Abelard would be an example. So there are some very unusual people who think that, oh yeah, maybe you could kind of rationally figure out that God is a Trinity, but that's a very unusual position. And for the most part, they say what you just said, which is, well, we know these things are true because they're in Revelation, but we would never have known without being told by God, right? And that means that the scope for pure hardcore rationalism in Islam, arguably, is greater than the scope for pure rationalism in medieval Christianity. If you kind of fast forward a little bit, you can also see that what happens in the Protestant Reformation is that the Protestants go even further in this direction and then say, well, you all need to stop trying to figure this out because you're using human reason. That will just lead you astray. Just go with whatever it says in scripture, right? Sola scriptura. We're only going to use scripture as a basis for our religious belief. And if it doesn't say it in scripture, do not believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Catholic response to that was sort of in the spirit of Ibn Rushd in a way, which was, well, it's not so clear what scripture means, so we need rational theology in order to figure that out. To which the Protestants said, no, you don't, because scripture is completely clear. And then they kind of ruined that response by disagreeing amongst themselves what it meant. But anyway, that you can see that like there's this very strong tendency in Christian theology, even amongst rationalist theologians, to admit that there are some things that go beyond the capacity of reason to grasp, which is not really that typical a position in Islam. I mean, there are literalists in Islam, but that's kind of for different reasons.
Right.
So I agree with you about that. This is not to say that Christianity is like an irrational religion or anything like that. I'm just trying to give a historical explanation for why certain positions you find in the Islamic world were not really occupied very often in Christianity. So then the next issue you raised is about authorities, right? So obviously everybody accepts that the Bible is authoritative, but it's more than that. It's also that everybody accepts that certain patristic authors are authoritative, again, until the Protestants come along. So the Protestants say, well, forget all these Latin and Greek church fathers. We're just going to read the Bible. Thank you very much. But throughout the Middle Ages, a figure like Augustine, or even John of Damascus, an early Byzantine theologian, these are people whose works are treated with immense respect. And it's kind of assumed that whatever they say is going to be true. It might just be that you need to do some massaging of the text and thinking very hard and interpretive fancy footwork to figure out what they meant. So then what happens around the turn of the 13th century is that because they translate much more Aristotle than they had previously, because before that they really only had logical works by Aristotle. And once they get things like the physics and the metaphysics and on the soul, they're confronted with the question of whether Aristotle should be treated in the same way. So is Aristotle another authoritative text where we kind of assume that he's right? What he means and what the right thing is that he's saying might require some difficult interpretive work, but there must be something to whatever he's saying. So some people thought that there'd be kind of Aristotelian wing, and some people thought, well, why are you assuming that this pagan author who lived before the revelation of Christianity would be right about everything? That doesn't make sense. So maybe he's right some of the time, but maybe he's not. We have to figure it out. And that means that there's then this kind of running debate, which goes on through the 13th, 14th century and beyond, about the status of Aristotle as an authoritative bearer of knowledge.
Right. And one of the interesting things that you see as a result of these debates is that Aristotle, even though that he's sort of conceded that he is conceived as an authority figure, how Aristotle is read, it allows for a lot of different interpretations. Like I guess if you could, I haven't done scholarly work on this, but I'm assuming if you took Duns Scotus's commentaries on the metaphysics and put them aside Thomas Aquinas's commentaries on metaphysics, you would have significant differences between the two readings of the same text, and that even though that Latin scholastics utilize authorities, these authorities admitted of different interpretations and different readings.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I would say there are maybe two different kinds of debates that run through philosophy in this period. So one kind of debate is the debate, is Aristotle right about such and such? So for example, Aristotle seems pretty clearly to believe that the universe is eternal and was not created in time. So you could try to say, well, so Aquinas does this. Aquinas says, well, he actually isn't that emphatic about, I mean, Aquinas is completely wrong about this, but Aquinas sort of tries to make out a case that Aristotle was tentative in claiming that the universe was eternal. But the more typical thing is people say, well, you can either be an Aristotelian and think the world is eternal, or you can be a Christian and believe that it was created. So, and we pay a lot of attention to debates like that, but actually most debates in medieval philosophy by far have the form that you just said. So something like the problem of universals, about which a huge amount of ink was spilled in the medieval tradition, that was a debate about whether universal things like humanity exist. Are they real, or are they only individual humans? So it is a debate about that, but it's always also a debate about what Aristotle's position was. And that's true for, you know, the relationship between the soul and the body, the question of whether the soul can outlive the body, the relationship between the intellect and the soul, and on and on and on. So all of the kind of standard, almost all the standard medieval debates are debates that are happening kind of simultaneously at the level of what is true and at the level of what does Aristotle mean in his text. And of course, the unspoken assumption behind that is that whatever is true is whatever Aristotle should be saying, and vice versa. So you can actually argue that Aristotle meant X by arguing that X is true, and vice versa.
Right. And I like how what you said a little earlier about how sometimes in trying to bolster Aristotle, they'll give very, very charitable readings, or they'll sort of fudge the text to sort of fit their own worldview. Like with Aquinas, he'll downplay the significance about the eternity of the world in Aristotle's cosmology, and then he's going, hey, look at the argument for motion. It's kind of I wouldn't say a rhetorical tactic, but it's they're sometimes they're willing to incorporate, or not incorporate, but they're willing to overlook certain aspects of a certain thinker's thought that are harder to jive with Christianity, and they'll try their best to maybe downplay that aspect of a particular thinker's thought.
Yeah. Although, of course, they know that they're living in a context where other people are going to leap to point out these apparent clashes between Aristotelianism and Christian belief. So they can't really get away with just ignoring it. And that's why they do lots of things where so for a good example would be just what I just mentioned. So the standard position on Aristotle's teaching on the soul in the medieval period is something that very, very few Aristotle scholars would accept now, namely that the human soul can survive the death of the body.
Mm.
And that wasn't just like one option on the table. That was really pretty much universally accepted by readers of Aristotle in the Middle Ages. And the question was more like, well, which exact powers of the soul would survive without the body? What exactly is the way you can get that teaching out of Aristotle's text? So there's a lot of debate about that sort of thing, but there isn't really any doubt that he's got the right view, namely that we can live on after death.
Right. Yeah, and another difficulty, though, that happens at this time is that texts at this point in time, the authorship and the historical critical sort of scholarship isn't always up to snuff, you might say, and certain works are admitted into the canon of Aristotle that aren't actually Aristotle. There's like this one like collection of like are not articles, but like works of Plotinus that's like subsumed into like the Aristotelian corpus, like the Theology of Aristotle, I think is what it's called, and or another work is the Liber de Causis. It's basically like cliff notes of Proclus's writings, but they're sort of it was sort of assumed that this was also an Aristotelian text as well.
Yeah, the Theology of Aristotle, which is the Arabic translation of Plotinus, is actually what I wrote my first book about, now more than 20 years ago. And that text actually isn't so important for the Latin tradition. I mean, it was translated into Latin eventually, but the second text you mentioned is really important. So it was actually produced in Arabic at around the same time in the 9th century. And it's a summary, paraphrase, and reorganization of Proclus's Elements of Theology. In Arabic, it was called the Book of the Pure Good. And when it was translated into Latin, it picked up the title Book of Causes, because it has a lot to say about supernatural causes. So Liber de Causis, Book of Causes. And it travels under the authorship of Aristotle, as did the Theology of Aristotle. So both Arabic Plotinus and Arabic Proclus were at least sometimes labeled as being by Aristotle. And the kind of exciting thing about this is that the person who announced that the Liber de Causis was not Aristotle was none other than Thomas Aquinas, because during his lifetime, the original text by Proclus was translated from Greek. And so they could look at them, these two
side by
texts,
side.
oh, wait, these are basically the same book. So actually, this is not Aristotle, it's actually Proclus. It's actually not clear how many people were really convinced that these two books were by Aristotle, either in the Islamic world or in the Latin-speaking world. So, for example, Avicenna mentions that there's some doubt about the authorship of the theology. And I think actually people often go too far in assuming that Aristotle's supposed authorship of these Neoplatonic works is sort of the explanation for why Neoplatonism had such an impact on philosophy in the Islamic world, and then maybe in Latin philosophy as well. There's maybe some truth to that, but actually late ancient Greek philosophy is already a combination of Neoplatonism with Aristotle. So that was always going to happen. And the fact that there was some Neoplatonic material circulating under Aristotle's name certainly helped perpetuate that, but I don't think it's really the reason that was going to happen no matter what.
Right. I mean, even after Thomas Aquinas discovers that the Liber de Causis isn't written by Aristotle, he doesn't jettison it. Like, he still incorporates it into his philosophy overall.
I think it's a really interesting text. And the other thing to bear in mind here is that that's not the only place they can get Neoplatonism. So there's some Neoplatonism in Augustine. And then there's also a really fascinating author called the Pseudo-Dionysius. So this is a late ancient text which is full of Neoplatonic ideas, but put into a Christian context. In fact, he's drawing on Proclus, but he presents himself as being a figure who lived at the time of the apostles and actually saw Jesus live. And he says his name is Dionysius, and he's referring to a character, or a person who's mentioned in the Bible named Dionysius. So he's actually much later, right? He lives after Proclus, so he's late ancient. So that's why we call him the Pseudo-Dionysius. And Aquinas wrote a commentary on a work by the Pseudo-Dionysius and cites him all over the place. So he thinks that Pseudo-Dionysius is the bee's knees. And so he had more than one source for Neoplatonic ideas. There's lots of Neoplatonism flowing into Aquinas from lots of different sources.
Right. Well, I figured we're nearing the end of our interview, but I have a few more questions that I figured I could ask. Another interesting conflict that happens at this time, going off of the of what we've been discussing about the conflict of authorities, there's a very interesting debate among Abrahamic faiths at this time about which divine revelation was superior or more critical, or no, it's not more critical, more credible. How exactly were those debates hashed out in a peaceful academic context, I should say?
Yeah, of course, a lot of what they did was fight wars with each other. But if you think about what sort of philosophically minded people are doing, the situation again is actually very different in the Islamic world and the Latin Christian worlds. Because in the Latin Christian world, although there are some Jews living around in Latin Christian Europe, it's not really a multi-religious society. Whereas there are parts of the Islamic world that remain majority Christian until well after the Islamic conquests, right? I mean, centuries after. And the same thing is true in Spain, in the modern Middle East, like Syria and so on. So if you think about a historical context, like let's say Baghdad, which is this vast city that's established by the Abbasid Caliphate, there are whole neighborhoods of Christians, there are churches, there are neighborhoods of Jews. The Jews and the Christians are able to regulate their communities using Christian and Jewish law rather than Islamic law. So you have an extremely kind of diverse, multi-religious society. And that leads to a lot of conflict, actually, but although it also leads to cooperation. For example, the translation of these Greek works by Aristotle and others, and Plotinus and Prof actually, the translations were actually done by Christians for Muslims who were the patrons of the translation process. So, so basically, if you're a Muslim in 10th century Baghdad, let's say, you are going to be face to face every day with Christians and Jews, and maybe even members of other religions as well. But those are the main actors. And that means that we have a lot of texts which speak to that circumstance. So we have texts which kind of offer a battery of arguments that you can use to defend Islam against a Christian or vice versa. We have texts reporting debates between a Christian and a Muslim. One of the most fascinating is a debate between the Patriarch Timothy of the East Syrian Church and the Caliph Mahdi. So supposedly, the Caliph himself had a debate in court with the leading Christian religious authority of the time. And then we have a record of that debate from Timothy himself. So believe that if you want. And just in general, there's a lot of kind of intellectual material being generated by this fact that you've got religions kind of rubbing up against each other. And just as they sometimes broke out into actual violence physically, there's a lot of what you might call intellectual violence, like debate, which may be more or less calm and fair. Right? So some of it's just abusive. So you get a lot of, people saying that Jews are too hung up on the pleasures of the body.
Worldly, yeah.
But you also get a lot of pretty refined material, like using Aristotelian logic to prove that the Trinity works or that it doesn't work.
Right.
So there's actually, there's a whole history you can write about the deployment of Aristotelian and Platonist philosophy in ecumenical disputes. And sometimes that takes the form of Jews, Christians, and Muslims coming together to work on Aristotelian philosophy together. And sometimes it takes the form of them using Aristotelian-inspired arguments to refute each other.
That's very interesting what you say about Aristotle. In some ways, sort of sets the stage for a lot of these interreligious debates, especially on the nature of the Trinity. If I remember correctly, I think it's Boethius who more or less like subsumes the categories into his treatises on the Trinity and discussing about substance and relation and how that works in God. And because of that allows the possibility of all these people who will accept Aristotle and his philosophy to critique, debate, and discuss whether or not the Trinity or other articles of the faith obtain.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really interesting text. But Boethius is really late ancient.
Right.
So he dies in 525. He's an important source for medieval philosophy. And he wrote a short work called On the Trinity, in which he goes through the Aristotelian categories and asks whether they apply to God. And that's supposed to pave the way for saying that you can understand the persons of the Trinity as relations. Although they're going to be relations that don't work exactly the way that
they subsist work. And
and in particular, he says that the strange thing about the relations in the Trinity is that you have asymmetrical relations, like the Father to the Son. So you have this relation of fatherhood that God bears towards himself. So it's an asymmetrical relation, yet we've only got one object there, namely God.
Right.
He says, well, that's weird. But then the point, I guess, is, well, it's supposed to be weird because it's a mystery. And so it goes back to that point about you can't explain this fully and with rational discourse, but you can get pretty close, in Boethius's opinion. But then if you look at what happens, for example, in the early Islamic world, you have a philosopher named al-Kindi, who was actually involved in the production of the Arabic Plotinus and Proclus material, as we talked about before. He wrote a treatise refuting the Trinity using material drawn from Aristotelian logic, which provoked a response from a Christian philosopher named Yahya Ibn Adi, who said, oh, Kindi, if you were better at Aristotelian logic, you would know that the Trinity works just fine. And he also invokes the idea of using relations. So there's a lot of debate about whether Aristotelian philosophy supports Christianity, undermines Christianity, and so on.
Interesting. Well, I think that covers a lot of what I was hoping we could discuss today. If I can ask a couple closing questions. One, do you have any book recommendations for those who'd want to learn more about medieval philosophy, or not just with respect to the use of authority? I very much enjoyed your book. Don't think for yourself is an excellent title, but maybe also philosophy in general. I'll be sure to link your podcast in the description.
Yeah, I mean, if people prefer books to podcasts, their book versions of the podcasts on the Philosophy in the Islamic World series and the Medieval Philosophy series, also Byzantine Renaissance philosophy, that's all out already. I mean, other things that are worth checking out. John Marenbon has written numerous good introductions to medieval philosophy. So he's someone I would recommend. There's also a huge 2-volume guide to I guess called the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy, edited by Robert Pasnow. That's also very good. Something we haven't talked about, but I think is worth looking into, is women in medieval philosophy. So people like Christina Van Dyck have done really interesting work on medieval women mystics, who I talk about a little bit also in my book, the Don't Think for Yourself book. So there's a lot of material out there. One thing, by the way, is if people go to my podcast website, I have reading lists on every period that I cover, and also on every topic or figure that I cover on the relevant page. So even if you don't want to listen to the podcast, which you should, but if you don't want to, you can still use the website as a kind of resource for what I am suggesting as at least some of the more important literature on each topic.
Well, this has been an excellent conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Adamson, for coming on.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed it.